I don't think I need to tell you that Bleach has a genuinely amazing cast of characters, and among that cast of characters are some truly iconic, well-designed and memorable villains. And in fact, I think that's a big part of why I have such an enduring affection for this series. Generally speaking, as a reader, I always enjoy the bad guys more than the good. In stories, I just find them to be more interesting overall. And while Bleach does have a truly great selection of heroes as well, many of which I really enjoy, it is the bad guys that I still find the most enjoyment. Whether that's the Espada, Execution, or the Sternritter, I do genuinely love them all. And I was kind of going through my older videos the other day to try and get some inspiration for some kind of new topics to talk about, and I came across one that actually caught my eye. And that was a video I did on the Espada versus the Vandenreich, and this was 8 years ago this video came out. And basically in the video I just tried to deduce what I believe to be the superior villainous organisation within the story. And the funny thing is, 8 years ago, you know, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc was not only still underway, it had only really just come out. So there was obviously some recency bias there. I was very excited and hepped up to see with these new Quincy bad guys. But I think it'd be really fascinating to revisit this topic with a slightly more mature eye, to look at it now the whole series is over, we've got the benefit of hindsight behind us. And I want to go back to comparing these two major villainous organisations in Bleach to try and work out which was the superior one. And for this video today, I think there's no place better to begin than right at the very top. So in this video today, I'm going to be trying to compare and contrast the characters of Sosuke Aizen and Yhwach, two of the major, most fearsome villains in the entire series. Now, this video is not really a question of who's stronger or anything like that. We're going to be trying to find out from a narrative perspective which of these two characters made for the better main antagonist. And I do have a criteria by which we're going to look at in this video. And before we begin, guys, if you haven't hit the subscribe button yet, make sure to do that now. We're about 200 subs away from 60,000, so if you can push me there, tip us over the edge, that would be absolutely amazing. I'd really appreciate that. If you want to give the video a thumbs up as well, because it does really help with exposure on YouTube. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has come out recently for videos like the Unohana analysis and the Shunsui Bankai video. I really appreciate that as well. And if you want to take that support a tiny bit further, we do also have a Patreon now where you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. We're closing in on 50 patrons, which would be another great milestone for this channel to hit. So if you want to help support me over there, that would be really appreciated as well. And a huge thanks goes out to everyone who is already a patron. So, Sosuke Aizen and Yhwach, the showdown of the century. Two genuinely great characters who make up the bulk of the antagonistic threat of the story of Bleach. One of them is a sort of conniving Machiavellian villain who at the start is kind of unassuming but eventually takes on a larger-than-life role. And the other one is quite literally a deity, the closest thing to a god we really have in this series, who eventually toppled the foundations of the world as we know it on a quest to rewrite it in a brand new image. Both of these characters have had a pretty enormous impact on Bleach as a whole. So how on earth do we go about trying to compare these guys? And at the end of the day, fundamentally, they are very different characters as well. So I have come up with a pretty loose criteria, but the one I'm going to be using for this video. And remember as well, crucially, some housekeeping. This video is just my opinion as to who I think is the better villain overall. Now, the criteria I'm going to be using kind of breaks down a bit like this. We're going to be looking at their overall character and their role they play in the story, their general feats and effectiveness in the story as well, how they manage their role as an antagonist and the kind of threat that they pose throughout, and then finally, their legacy and lasting impact, both on the story and on us as readers. I also think for the sake of transparency, it's really important for me to point a couple of things out about myself and my history with this series. Aizen is my favourite character in Bleach. There's not really any getting around that, just as I feel like he is for a lot of people as well. That doesn't mean that Yhwach, however, is left out of the loop. Yhwach's actually easily one of my favourite parts about the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and I really think he is definitely one of the best things to come out of the final arc of Bleach. So I'm going to try and approach this as objectively as I possibly can, as I try to do in all of the videos that involve my opinion in some way. And as always, do let me know in the comments below which of these villains you find to be superior, and I'd love to see your detailed thoughts as to why that is and how you would compare the two. So just to look then, like I said, at the overall character of these two guys. And let's start with Aizen. Now, Aizen is a slow character. He's a slow burn villain, in my opinion. He's methodical, he's conniving, he's always planning and scheming in the shadows. In many ways, he fits the sort of shadowy master puppeteer trope. He's kind of making sure that everything falls into place behind the scenes. And this is emblematic through many of the memes that have come out of Aizen as a character. You know, everything is going according to my plan. I've planned out literally everything. Everything is going to Aizen's plan. As a Bleach fan, you've probably seen that somewhere on the internet, and that stems from the fact that Aizen is always 100 steps ahead of nearly everyone else. I always loved this, and I think most people do as well, even though it does sometimes get taken to ridiculous extremes. On the flip side, however, though, in my opinion, Aizen's kind of the fact that he is almost wary of being completely on the front lines until right at the end of the series, it makes him somewhat more of a traditional villain, but also, in my opinion, it hampers his overall effectiveness, and it does really make him come across as a very slow burn bad guy. Aizen is very much playing the long game in Bleach. You can see his machinations from as early as the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, and everything is building and building to eventually him achieving his ultimate goal. And when he falls short of that ultimate goal after what feels like ages, it can come across as unsatisfying, I think. Now, conversely, there's Yhwach, and Yhwach comes from an interesting position in Bleach in that Kubo quite obviously didn't have the same amount of time to build this character up as he did with Aizen. I think Kubo got to the final arc, and to the man's credit, he really wanted to deliver on as many of his promises as he possibly could for us, and that meant that the arc was going to be stacked. And so Kubo didn't have the luxury to really build Yhwach with the same slow burn that he did with Aizen. However, I don't think this is a bad thing. In fact, I think it directly benefits Yhwach as a character. It means he gets immediately into the action, we immediately get to know him, and he's immediately more impressive in many ways as well. The fact that Yhwach is there, boots on the ground in the first invasion, taking out Yamamoto, is really awesome. And you can't imagine Aizen fighting anyone until the very end of the Arrancar arc, because that's just not how he does things. And so I think that's definitely something in Yhwach's favour. This difference in how Kubo handles these two characters really helps to differentiate them as well, and they do play vastly different roles in the story, even if they play the same overarching role as of main villain. Aizen really chooses to leave everything up to his underlings until right at the last minute. It's very much the Espada story until about the second half of Fate Karakura Town. Meanwhile, Yhwach is down with his men almost all the time. He's initiating these ruthless attacks and these invasions, and that actually makes total sense. Yhwach's a warlord at the end of the day. 1,000 years ago, he was invading and conquering the entirety of the human world, with his sights set on something even grander in the Soul Society. So actually, their different approaches to how they go about their plans makes total sense. And speaking of their plans, I don't think we can really talk about their role in the story without considering their ultimate motivations and goals, as that of course actually helps drive generally the entire plot forwards. Aizen's motivation is made very clear pretty early on in the Arrancar arc, which I really appreciate. It's made clear that Aizen is targeting Karakura Town because it's a spiritually dense and rich area, and he wants to wipe it off the face of the earth to create the Oken, the King's Key, which will allow him access to the royal palace, at which point he can assassinate the king and sit upon the throne of heaven. Easy, simple to understand, everyone has something to rally against, but there's also a little bit more to it. There's that subtext that Aizen doesn't like authority, he's not a fan of what's going on at the very top of the Soul Society hierarchy, and I really like that. I think the motivation for Aizen was handled really well. On the flip side, Yhwach's motivation is muddied, it is weird and confusing, and doesn't even really get mentioned until the final chapter of the series. And in my opinion, Yhwach's motivation is one of easily the weakest points of this character. On the very final chapter of Bleach, it's mentioned by Yhwach that he wanted to essentially take the human world, Hueco Mundo, and Soul Society, smash them all together, and return them to their primordial state where life and death were intertwined, and death technically wasn't a thing because they're all the afterlife and the present day are the same. In theory, you might think that's actually pretty cool. It's quite a unique motivation, it's actually pretty interesting, and for a series about the afterlife, smashing the two together is pretty cool on paper. The problem with Yhwach's motivation, in my opinion, is that he never, ever expresses any kind of desire to do this prior to basically the very end of the series. It is mentioned that he wants to destroy all three worlds, and that's enough to get the characters to rally against him, but it's never really explained why. And his motivation also seems to just chop and change as the arc goes on as well. At one point it's mentioned that he doesn't actually seem to want to take the powers of the Soul King, he just wants to remove him from his eternal humiliation. Then he decides on the fly, actually I am going to take the powers of the Soul King. Then he decides, actually I'm going to rebuild the Quincy Nation, which in my opinion is the superior motivation that they probably should have gone with in the end. Because it's weird to me as well that Kubo just completely drops the kind of grudge that the Quincy have. I think it would have been awesome if Yhwach was like, I'm going to rebuild the ancient Quincy Nation, give my people somewhere to live now, and I think that would have been really, really good, but instead it's just this nebulous idea of bad guy wants to destroy all the worlds for some reason, and then at the very, very end it's actually explained. So as far as their motivations go, I do prefer Aizen's. I think it's much better and it's handled much better, and it's so frustrating as well because all we really would have needed was just a few lines of dialogue at some point from Yhwach explaining what he wants and why he wants it, but we just don't get it until it's too late. So that's kind of their characters in a nutshell, their overall roles in the story. They both play the driving force of the main bad guy for their respective story arcs, Aizen wanting to completely shake things up at the very top of the Soul Society hierarchy, Yhwach just wanting to get rid of everything and start anew, basically. Both fascinating, both really interesting, and both very much dominating their villainous spaces, but let's now look at their feats and their effectiveness in the story, as in my opinion, this is where the gulf between them actually widens considerably. We'll start again with Aizen. Now Aizen, his actual feats and his effectiveness, I think, can honestly be called into question, and in my opinion, this is the weakest part of this character and where he falls down the most. It's very impressive in the Soul Society arc that Aizen is able to use the powers of Kyokusui gets to completely fool everyone and enact his plan to get the Hogyoku, and I like that. I think that's really well written. Unfortunately, after that, Aizen just virtually disappears into the background, and as I mentioned at the start of this video, essentially allows his Espada to take the reins for nearly 200 chapters before eventually deciding to kind of join the fight himself in the Fate Karakura Town arc. Like I said, this leads to a feeling of, ineffectiveness. He spent hundreds and hundreds of chapters trying to essentially start a war against the Soul Society, turn himself into this hybrid being, this all-powerful being, to then assault the royal palace, and nothing comes of it until all of his Espada are dead, which makes him look like a bad leader in many ways. Then he takes on the Soul Society, defeats them all, which is impressive, but it's, in my opinion, soured a little bit by the fact that it was necessary in the first place. And then he gets defeated by Ichigo with ease before even reaching the royal palace. So it's difficult, it's really hard to say how effective Aizen actually is as a bad guy. He spends so long trying to get to the point that he kind of misses the mark entirely by the time he gets there, in my opinion. It's a real shame that Aizen's been building and building to this for hundreds of years, and then he doesn't even make it to the royal palace. And that seems kind of crazy to me when you think about it. And it does lend it to being a little bit unsatisfying. This is completely turned on its head with Yhwach. Yhwach is the total opposite of Aizen in nearly every single way in this regard, and I think that's clearly done on purpose. Yhwach arrives, he attacks the Soul Society, conquers Waco Mundo, and defeats Harabel like it's absolutely nothing before trampling Soul Society and killing Yamamoto. And this is in the first 40 chapters of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. And you might be thinking, okay, well, Kubo knows he has a lot of ground to cover in the final arc, so he's just doing things quickly. But no, this trend of Yhwach's carries on right until the very end of this arc. In about 100 chapters, Yhwach has already invaded the royal palace, which is more than Aizen managed to do in the entire time of his tenure as main villain. But not only does Yhwach actually set foot in that holy land, his Schutzstaffel kill the Zero Division, and he then kills the Soul King. And then he goes further. That's the thing. Yhwach just keeps going further. He kills the Soul King, takes all the Soul King's power for himself, transforms the land around him to create Varvel, which is essentially this holy Quincy palace, completely usurping the royal realm. It's one of these things that I wish we'd spent more time looking at the ramifications of this, because Yhwach upends a millennia of Soul Society history. Completely just changes everything. Yhwach, the final villain of Bleach, is the Soul King, because Yhwach is the Soul King. Sat on his mighty throne, Varvelt means true world. He's kind of just created essentially the centerpiece for this brand new world he wants to make. He obviously doesn't get to finish that new world, otherwise everyone would be dead. But leaps and bounds, he does so much more than Aizen. He accomplishes so much more than Aizen. And of course, there's a lot of third-party variables to consider here. Kubo himself obviously was in a different place when he was writing Aizen's stuff compared to Yhwach's stuff. Bleach as a series was in a different place. It's only natural with the final arc that you need to up the stakes. But that's not Yhwach's fault. It's not my fault he happened to be the villain at the time, and he just does a considerably better job of making the Shinigami suffer. They are suffering at every turn in the final arc. I think Shinji even mentions at one point, at what point is our enemy going to stop getting a one-up on us? And it's really true. Yhwach is constantly pushing them around, stepping all over them, and just achieving his goals one after the other. And I think that's really commendable. And as a bad guy, it made the 1,000-Year Blood War arc so entertaining, at least in my opinion anyway, just to see this guy who's like a juggernaut steamroll through everything that we've had so far. And I personally thought that worked really well. And then, like I said, on the flip side, you've got Aizen, who works very much in the shadows. He's got the puppeteer tropes, but also kind of the mad scientist tropes as well. He is a smaller scale villain, which sounds really weird to say because he wants to become God, essentially. And I think that's the great irony, that Aizen wants to become God, but the way he is written and the way he is integrated into the lore actually makes him the more intimate of the two bad guys. He has more of a personal connection to nearly everyone he is fighting, as he has betrayed them all at some point or another because he used to be one of them. And that, I think, is a super important distinction between Aizen and Yhwach. Aizen used to be one of these guys, and he doesn't want to be anymore. He wants to be something more. From the very beginning, Yhwach is something more. That's the thing. There is that degree of separation where Yhwach has never been one of anything, really. He's not the same as everyone else at all. He's always been this god, this godlike figure. Even before he was the Soul King, he was a thing of legend in the Quincy religion. So Aizen comes from a lower background, essentially, of villainy than Yhwach. And it's interesting seeing him work his way up, worm his way out of the shadows. The term at the pendulum arc is brilliant. And they do both have great feats at the end of the day. Aizen takes out the entire Gotei 13 on his own. He's smart enough to work around Yamamoto and has Wonder Weiss essentially take him out. As kind of his Hogyoku transformations progress, he defeats Isshin, Urahara, Yoroichi. Overall, Aizen's feats cannot be understated, but Yhwach's are kind of on another level. Like, he kills Yamamoto, he kills Ichibei, he kills the Soul King. One thing I've always kind of thought, actually, looking back at the 1,000-Year Blood War, is I would have loved Yhwach to interact with more people. I would have loved to have seen, and this is such a headcanon of mine, a fan fiction, but Shunsui and Ukitake versus Yhwach would have just been a brilliant fight. Like, it would have been so good to have seen. I'd have loved to have seen it. But it doesn't happen. But that's fine. They both have impressive feats, but they come, crucially, from very different places as bad guys, which I think is really important to remember. There is that degree of separation. Aizen was just one of them, one of the many, and now he wants to become the sole person at the top. Yhwach has always been that sole person at the top, which I think is really fascinating. And you can kind of even see that with the way they rule their organizations. You know, Yhwach rules the Sternritter with an iron fist. You know, there is that degree of separation quite literally when he speaks to them all. He's standing on top of like a stage. None of them can get anywhere near him. They're all aghast that Uryu is on the same level as him. That creates that boss, that superior underling mentality, literally by having him looking down on them, almost like he's proclaiming to them. Whereas Aizen sits down and has tea with the Espada at the same table. You know, there's an obvious class difference between these two bad guys. And what's cool about Aizen's is, Aizen's a little less straightforward than Yhwach. Yhwach's is very obviously, I'm your boss. Aizen is kind of manipulating all of them at the same time, which is really cool. You know, he's asserting his control over them through manipulation, having them believe they're kind of all on the same level, all striving for the same goal, which I think is why Harabelle seems so angry when he betrays her. She's kind of like, I thought you shared our vision, but Aizen's like, get out of my sight. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent. That kind of came out of nowhere, but I think it kind of works. Ties in a bit more to their overall role in the story, and actually maybe into the next part as well. So we'll jump to that now, which is how they managed their role as a villain and the threat they posed. And like I said, that degree of separation, really important to how they managed their role as bad guys and the threat they posed. And I think, again, Yhwach probably definitely poses more of a threat than Aizen throughout the story, again, in that he actually achieves his goals. That being said, how they manage their role as villains, I think Aizen remains a genuinely enjoyable bad guy from start to finish. And if you really, really love the conniving Aizen, the scheming Aizen, then you might get a little disappointed with how he sort of unravels in Deicide, even though I always found it to be very in character. And that's the benefit, I guess, of him not achieving his goal, is that you see him lose his mind after hundreds of years of planning just fall apart around him. That's exactly how I think he would act. And so I think Aizen does remain genuinely enjoyable throughout, and I think that he plays his role as main villain really, really well. And the proof is in the pudding. You know, for so many people, Aizen is their favourite character. For so many people, Aizen is Bleach. He is totally iconic, in a way that Yhwach absolutely isn't. And now, of course, that's not totally fair of me to say. The anime is not out yet for the 1,000-Year Blood War. Anything could change. But as we sit here right now, I could make this video a year from now if the anime's out and talk about it then. But here and now, Aizen is iconic. And Yhwach is not really, and I think that comes from Aizen's character, his characterization. He's so unlike so many characters we've seen before, I think. Whereas Yhwach does come across slightly more as your standard big bad boss, which I have no problem with. I think that was perfect for the final arc. In my opinion, I've mentioned this before as well, Yhwach does lose his luster a bit as a villain after he absorbs the Soul King. In fact, it's not after he absorbs the Soul King, it's actually after he activates the Almighty, I think, that he actually really becomes less interesting. Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu was only a part of him. You know, it was only a part of what made him so good. You know, he had like a two-pronged attack where he could use Kyoka Suigetsu to just completely hypnotize everyone, make them stab Momo. But what was crucial about that scene to Aizen's success as a villain was that he would then hit Shinji with that barbed attack where he was like, when were you under the impression that I wasn't using Kyoka Suigetsu? It's that trolly nature of Aizen that people have made fun of, but it works so well. With Yhwach, unfortunately, he starts out like this convention-busting, awesome character who seemed like genre-savvy, didn't want to conform to fantasy regulations. He would just go around killing people, and it wouldn't matter because he felt quite real in that sense. And then, unfortunately, in my opinion, after he activates the Almighty, it kind of goes out of the window, and he turns into this, like, just nonsense spouting godlike figure, which I guess is what Kubo was going for. But when you kind of go back and look at Yhwach's dialogue from him using the Almighty onwards, he says very little, with a lot of words. Like, he uses an awful lot of words to say virtually nothing of importance to you as the reader, which really sucks. And I think Kubo was trying to keep things cryptic, keep the mystery up around the Soul King. But at some point, we really could have done with some answers in the manga itself, and we just don't get them. And that a big part of that is Yhwach just talking rubbish the whole time, which really sucks, going on and on and on about Ichigo and him sharing blood. And it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. That doesn't matter, so we don't really need to hear it. Whereas Aizen controlling Ichigo was conducive to Ichigo's entire growth up until the Fate Karakura Town fight. So that is actually an important twist, even if it was a stretch too far for some people. But with Yhwach, it's like, I don't care. I don't care that you and Ichigo have the same blood, because Ichigo's made it very clear that he is not interested in working with you in any way. So stop talking about it. That's kind of the problem I have with that. And I think that Yhwach does become genuinely less interesting. And that's reflected in how he acts as well. Like, prior to this, he is this really physical fighter. That first showdown he has with Ichigo is just so unlike anything you would expect to see. His, like, enormous hands, like, grabbing Ichigo and just grappling him and smashing him into the floor. And that is where his real screen presence comes from. And you totally lose that by the end of the series, by the fact that he's just sat in his chair and all that's happening is darkness is coming out. And it's like, it's so difficult because I get it. I get what Kubo's going for. Yhwach has become, like, so powerful. He is a god. He doesn't need to move anymore. He's just going to fight you in his chair while he's throwing his overwhelming Reiatsu all over the place. But just because I get it doesn't mean I have to like it, and I don't like it as much as the warmongering physical fighter Yhwach from the early days. That is a little disappointing. Whereas at least Aizen, I think, does remain fairly consistent throughout, and I think that the changes to his personality are pretty well explained. And, you know, as for the threat they pose, which is a bit of a tangent again, but it feeds off that last bit we were talking about, I do love Aizen. He's never felt like the most threatening villain to me. And again, that's, I think, due to Kubo just not really using him for stuff like that. He's not supposed to be like that. You know, he's obviously willing to do horrible things. You know, he kills the Central 46, but I think it is that lack of danger, I think, surrounding not just Aizen, but the Espada and the Urankar in general that kind of hurts him there. Whereas Yhwach, there's definitely a sense of threat. Yhwach is, at least earlier on, unpredictable. You know, if someone's going into a battle with him, you don't know if they're actually going to make it out alive, which is really refreshing. And I think there's definitely more of a threat level from Yhwach, and that permeates down to the rest of the Vandenreich as well. And that's one thing that the final arc absolutely nails, as far as I'm concerned, is threat level. That sense of danger that's just completely absent from the Urankar arc, which I've talked about before, is rectified big time in the final arc, and Yhwach plays a huge part in that. And so we come finally to the end with their lasting impact, their legacy on both the series and the readers. And again, it's difficult because there's no anime yet for the final arc. However, I just want to give my 2 cents. As I mentioned earlier, Aizen is my favourite character. And, you know, there's plenty of reasons for that. I love the way he's written. You know, he looks cool. He's got great power. His involvement in the backstories of so many characters makes him really intriguing to their development as well as his. And it is cool seeing him going through the motions and changing and breaking down later on. But, you know, crucially, I like him for the same reason everyone else does, that Machiavellian aspect where he's planned everything out. He is so, like, deliciously evil, to use a cliched phrase. You know, those scenes where he gets shadows on his face and he's, like, doing something nasty. It sounds tropey, but it really works. And so for so many people, like, he is Bleach, as I mentioned before, and he has had such an impact on the fan base, it's completely undeniable. And Yhwach, at least on the fan base, I feel like has had less of an impact overall. And this is from someone who was reading the Thousand Year Blood War arc day in, day out, every week, seeing the reactions, seeing how people felt. And I think, generally speaking, Yhwach started out really popular. I genuinely think he did. And his design as well is brilliant. To be honest, I can't fault either of these characters' designs. Aizen's, again, is a little more subtle. absolutely think it's creative genius the way Kubo can just make him look so unassuming and then remove his glasses, slick back his hair, and he's the most evil looking guy in the universe. I think that's really cool. And Yhwach, yeah, he's slightly more traditional fantasy Dark Lord type of character. But I still think it's a simple design. It's not over-designed. You've got the military uniform, but also the raggedy black cape making him look like a huge bat or something, working really well there. And then there's the ties to Zangetsu, which I think work really, really well as well. And it's so funny, like, you know, when he first appears in chapter 484, the forums were full. They were full of people being like, Kubo just can't draw anyone different anymore. This guy just looks like Zangetsu. Lo and behold, that's the whole point. You know, that was such a great little thing, such a great moment where I think Kubo got a real one-up over much of the audience. But I think definitely as time went on, Yhwach's shtick got a little old with people. And like I said, his change in characterization didn't help, I don't think. You know, and that's lambasted as well by the actual end of the series, which is obviously not Yhwach's fault. That's a little unfair, but I do think that has jaded people's perspective. Whereas Aizen is in many ways redeemed at the end of the series. If you didn't like what happened to him in Deicide, you will enjoy him in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. So, you know, as far as legacy goes and impact on fans, I think, you know, Aizen, and this again is all my opinion, based on what I know, what I've seen, what I feel. You can feel free completely to disagree with me in the comments. I think Aizen for sure has left more of a lasting impact. On the story, I think probably Yhwach did, because, you know, he completely rewrote the rules of the world of Bleach in many ways. But I think, yeah, it's fascinating. It is fascinating to take these two characters side by side because they are vital to Bleach. They're both totally crucial characters, complete, like, game-changing, world-changing characters, which is, again, why I find villains so fascinating. I could talk about bad guys all day. You know, like, good guys are all well and good. Kyoraku is one of my favourite characters in the series. Ichigo's a great main character, but none of them are trying to change the world. None of them are trying to rewrite the universe. And that's why villains are often so clearly the drivers of conflict. So that's a major ramble from me. And I think we need to end this video with a verdict. For me, I think the superior villain out of the two comes down to what you want from a bad guy in Bleach. And I have no hesitation in saying that Yhwach and the Sternritters were what Bleach needed when we got to the final arc. How Kubo actually handled them from that point on is a matter for debate. But I think Yhwach did a really good job, especially as he kind of had to come out of literally nowhere. And, you know, he kind of has to come out of nowhere, fill the boots of Aizen, and take on the role of main villain. I think he does that really well. As I said earlier, I think the fact that he comes in straight away, attacks with the first invasion, attacks Yamamoto, just takes the bull by the horns, essentially, takes the role of main villain by the horns and actually just really goes with it. I think that really works in Yhwach's favour. However, quintessential Bleach villain is Aizen, as far as I'm concerned. Aizen's the main bad guy of Bleach. He is the superior bad guy. I think those intimate ties to the Soul Society work really, really well in his favour. The fact that he was just one of them, and he has kind of gone rogue and he has his sights set on much greater things than himself and the rest of them, works really well. And there's just so much about him as well that I feel like is quite unique, where Yhwach is perhaps a little more generic, but I think a war arc needs it. But, you know, the fact that Aizen doesn't actually really want to kill any of the Shinigami apart from Yamamoto is really unique and just really cool, really great character turn. Even in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, when Kyoraku's like, if you kill me, you'll never get access to the keys that are buried inside my chest. And Aizen's like, those Central 46 guys really thought I would kill you to get out of here? Because he wouldn't do that. That's not Aizen. You know, he has respect for Kyoraku, which I think is really cool. And maybe I will do another sequel to this video in the future, because I feel like it deserves it. And it's just a great topic that I have a lot of fun talking about. Like, even talking about respect there just opens up another can of worms. Like, Yhwach has no respect for the Soul Society. Aizen does in many ways, and I really like that as well. A great differentiator between the two. So for me, maybe my biases do tar this somewhat, but I have tried to approach it objectively. I do think there are many things Yhwach does better than Aizen, but Aizen is quintessentially the Bleach bad guy. He has ties to the Vizards, to the Gotei, to Urahara, to Ichigo in some way, although Kubo does a good job of integrating Yhwach into the lore as well. But Aizen, that slow burn does work really well. Yes, it's a shame he doesn't get further with his ultimate goal, but overall, I think he is the superior bad guy in Bleach. I think he's just, I think the fans speak for themselves. However, one thing I love about this series, as I've mentioned before, is that I think no matter which one of those you were to pick as your favourite, you are going to have a great time, because Kubo does a really good job with both of them as the leading villainous roles. And by differentiating the two characters in such dramatic ways, they can both succeed in separate areas, which I think is really vital overall. Alright guys, but I really hope you enjoyed the video. I feel like it was maybe a little bit rambly. I had an awful lot to say, an awful lot to go through, but in the end I've chosen Aizen. Sosuke Aizen, to me, is the superior main villain out of the two of them, but really, like I said, it's a win-win situation for Bleach fans. Alright, but until next time guys, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.